It was supposed to be a routine panel. The kind cable networks aired every week, loud voices, big opinions, and no real consequences. But this one would be different. The Fox News studio in Manhattan was buzzing with tension. The graphics on screen read, "Can the West still lead the world?" The camera panned to Pete Hegseth, seated confidently in a navy suit, eyes sharp with anticipation. Then the screen split. On the other side appeared a man in simple earth-toned robes, sleeves rolled up, posture relaxed yet commanding. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, and an unexpected guest. From the very beginning, it was clear this wasn't going to be civil. "So let me get this straight," Hegseth began, tapping his notes with his pen. "You reject our leadership, our aid, our values, and yet you show up to an American studio to preach?" Traoré didn't flinch. He met the camera with calm eyes. "I show up," he said slowly, "because the world is tired of being told who they are by those who never listened in the first place." The tension in the studio spiked. Hegseth leaned forward. "You hate our values. You resent freedom. You'd rather side with tyrants than stand with the West." Traoré didn't blink. "No," he said, voice steady. "I reject your hypocrisy. You speak of freedom while dictating terms. You speak of peace while selling weapons. You call it aid, but it's leverage." There was a pause. Viewers at home leaned in. Even the moderator looked caught off guard. Hegseth wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by someone like Traoré, someone the network had invited, hoping for an easy target. But now, the room belonged to Traoré. And Hegseth knew it. Social media lit up within minutes. Clips of Traoré's calm defiance were already circulating on X and TikTok. The hashtags #Traoré claps back, #Fox News meltdown, and #American hypocrisy trended globally. But inside the studio, Pete Hegseth wasn't scrolling. He was boiling. "You sit there in robes like some prophet," Pete snapped, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "but your country runs on aid, not ideology. We feed your people. We stabilize your region. You'd be lost without the West." Traoré tilted his head slightly. "Lost?" he repeated. "You mistake interference for guidance. You call it aid, but your dollars come with contracts. Your troops come with conditions. Your media sells the illusion of benevolence, but the world sees the strings." The moderator tried to pivot, sensing Hegseth's rising frustration. "Gentlemen, let's keep the discussion productive. President Traoré, what do you propose as an alternative?" Traoré leaned in slightly, hands calmly folded. "Self-determination," he said. "A return to dignity. Partnerships, not puppeteering. You say your values are universal, but they are only welcomed when they serve your interests." The silence in the studio was thick. Pete clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the table. "Is that what you tell your people?" Hegseth said, barely hiding his disdain. "That freedom is just another Western trap? That America's just a bully?" "I tell my people the truth," Traoré replied. "That we've survived colonizers in suits and uniforms. That we no longer measure our worth by Western applause. That our history didn't begin with your arrival, and it won't end with your permission." Boom. In that moment, something shifted. Even viewers who disagreed with Traoré's politics couldn't deny the power in his delivery. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He was resolute. And Pete Hegseth, once the loudest voice in any room, had been reduced to reacting, not leading. Pete Hegseth wasn't used to this. In most interviews, he controlled the tempo, intimidating, cornering, steering the narrative. But with Traoré, every jab he threw was met with clarity and restraint. And worse, indifference. "You sit here, lecturing us about dignity?" Pete said, his voice rising. "Your country's GDP is a rounding error in our defense budget. You talk about pride while begging for Chinese loans. Traoré didn't raise an eyebrow. Instead, he offered the most devastating reply yet, a faint smirk. It wasn't condescending. It was surgical. That's the problem, Mr. Hegseth, Traoré said. You measure nations like bank accounts. We measure them by spirit. A beat passed. Then he added, and we don't need billion-dollar budgets to know who we are. You do. The audience in the studio didn't make a sound. But in control rooms, editors were already clipping that line. It would go viral in minutes. Hegseth leaned back, feigning amusement. So you think you're above accountability? Above criticism? No, Traoré said simply. Just no longer beneath your approval. The moderator looked helpless. The control room was flashing countdowns, commercial break in 30 seconds. But the exchange had detonated something beyond TV. This wasn't about Burkina Faso anymore. It wasn't even about US foreign policy. It was about something deeper: identity, power, narrative ownership. And for the first time, millions of Americans were hearing a leader from the global South not asking for sympathy or aid, but declaring independence with words sharp enough to pierce through any filter. Pete tried one last swing. If you reject our system so much, why even come here? Traoré's answer came like a blade. To speak in your house. So you can't pretend you didn't hear me. Cut to black. Commercial break. But the real show had just begun. When the show returned from commercial, it wasn't just the lighting that felt different, it was the air itself. Stale. Heavy. Pete Hegseth adjusted his earpiece while stealing a glance at Traoré, who remained still, composed, untouched by the storm he had just ignited. The moderator fumbled through a new question. Mr. Hegseth, do you think there's space for alternative global leadership in today's world? Pete didn't answer immediately. He was recalculating. His usual fire and flag rhetoric wasn't working. So he tried a pivot. I believe in strength, Pete said, voice calmer now. In leading by example. But we won't apologize for our power. We've earned our place at the top. Traoré replied before the moderator could shift the floor. And that's precisely the delusion, he said. You believe hierarchy is destiny. That because you've dominated, you're destined to lead. But history teaches otherwise. Empires rise. Empires fall. And arrogance is always the beginning of the end. A low hum passed through the control booth. One producer muttered, he's not wrong. Pete clenched his fist beneath the desk. You speak like a man with no real army. No real economy. No leverage. But we're not equals. You know that. Traoré nodded slowly. In weapons? No. In propaganda? Not yet. But in purpose? Absolutely. And in truth, we're already ahead. Pete scoffed. Truth, he said. You can dress it in robes and slogans, but it won't feed people. Freedom does. That's where we differ, Traoré answered, his voice now like a teacher, not a guest. You mistake consumption for freedom. Noise for power. And control for leadership. But your system is cracking, not because others hate it, but because it betrayed itself. Silence again. Then, applause. Not from the audience, Fox didn't allow live clapping on this show, but from people watching at home, in universities, coffee shops, and embassies worldwide. They weren't just hearing a foreign leader speak. They were watching someone dismantle an entire worldview, live, sentence by sentence. And Pete Hegseth was left trying to pick up pieces of a narrative he no longer owned. The control room was scrambling. Producers whispered through headsets, unsure whether to pull the plug or ride the wave. The network had invited Ibrahim Traoré thinking he would stumble, that his accent, attire, or political position would make him an easy foil. Instead, he had taken the format, flipped it, and made it his stage. Pete Hegseth, ever the warrior, tried to reclaim ground. "You're here enjoying our freedom of speech, aren't you? In your country, media critics disappear." Traoré didn't blink. "And yet, I'm here. Unafraid. And you, who supposedly live in the land of free ideas, look terrified of mine." That hit hard. Even Pete's forced smile couldn't hide the tension in his jaw. "You see enemies everywhere," Pete snapped. "You question every motive, every handshake. That's not diplomacy, it's paranoia." "No," Traoré said, calmly adjusting his mic, "it's history. We remember coups dressed as aid, sanctions disguised as justice. We've read the fine print beneath your offers. You say partnership, we see ownership." The moderator jumped in, desperate to level the ground. "President Traoré, surely there are Western values you respect?" Traoré nodded. "Of course. I admire the ideals of liberty, democracy, and self-determination. But I reject how you export them, at gunpoint." Pete pounced. "So now we're the villains?" "No," Traoré replied. "You're just not the heroes you think you are." The room went still. It was the kind of moment that couldn't be edited away. No cheerin' could dilute it. No post-show spin could contain it. The line echoed like a verdict, not just against Pete Hegseth, but against an entire narrative of American moral superiority. People weren't just watching. They were waking up. On screen, Pete forced a laugh. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." Traoré offered a gentle nod. "No. I've got mirrors. And I'm simply holding one up." Backstage, Fox executives were pacing. They had invited Traoré expecting a spectacle, but not this kind. Not the kind where the spectacle was their own unraveling. The control room asked whether they should cut the final segment. The answer came quickly, no. Too late. Too viral. Back in the studio, the moderator tried to introduce a softer segment. "Let's shift slightly. President Traoré, what's your vision for cooperation between nations that disagree but seek peace?" Traoré didn't hesitate. "It begins with honesty. End the charades. Don't say partnership and install bases. Don't speak of freedom while funding tyrants. And don't invite us to the table if you've already written the rules." Pete interrupted. "That's rich, coming from someone who took power with a rifle in one hand and a manifesto in the other." "For survival," Traoré said. "Not ambition." He turned toward the camera. "We did not ask for this world. We inherited it broken. Shaped by people who took everything and now offer lectures. But we will not rebuild it in silence. We will name the damage. We will demand dignity. And we will not ask for permission." Pete shook his head. "This is fantasy. Your words are beautiful, but real politics is about power. Military, money, leverage. That's the real world." Traoré smiled faintly. "Then your real world is dying. Because the new one will not be built on threats, it will be built on truth." That smile, measured, unbothered, was the opposite of what Pete expected. He had thrown his sharpest lines, appealed to the flag, the economy, even fear. And none of it had pierced through. Traoré hadn't raised his voice once. And somehow, he'd won the room. From that moment forward, Pete Hegseth wasn't debating a man. He was shadowboxing a movement, a worldview that could no longer be ignored or dismissed with talking points. And the worst part? He knew it. Outside the building, the street had turned into a scene. Protesters, supporters, journalists, and influencers crowded near the Fox News headquarters. Some held up signs that read, "Let him speak." Others chanted, "Truth doesn't need a visa." Inside, the atmosphere thickened. Even the cameramen looked unsure where to point their lenses, Pete Hegseth or Ibrahim Traoré. One looked like a TV host under pressure. The other looked like a man who had already shifted the room's gravity. Pete tried to strike one final blow. "You're lucky we let you speak at all," he said. "If you tried to criticize a Western leader like this in your own country, you'd call it imperialism." Traoré turned his eyes directly toward him. "Lucky?" he said. "No. It's not luck. It's discomfort. You're not used to someone speaking this clearly from where I come from. You think you've given me space. But I took it." The moderator, visibly sweating now, tried to call time. "We're nearing the end." But Pete cut him off. "You think this makes you a leader? Coming here and blaming America for everything wrong in the world?" "No," Traoré answered. "What makes me a leader is that I can sit across from a man who thinks power is a microphone and still choose to speak the truth." That line landed like a gavel. It was no longer about ideology. It wasn't even about America versus Africa. It was about two worldviews colliding, one rooted in domination, the other in dignity. Pete looked down for the first time during the show. Traoré looked up. And viewers everywhere knew, instinctively, who had just owned the moment. The countdown clock blinked in red, 3 o'clock left. But it wasn't time that controlled the tension now, it was the silence. The kind that follows a shot heard round the world. Pete Hegseth's smile had turned into something tighter. Something uncertain. "Let's be honest, Traoré," he said with a chuckle that didn't land. "You're a temporary figure. 5 years from now, you'll be replaced. Forgotten. But the American system? We endure." That was the trigger. Traoré leaned forward, not angrily, but deliberately. "Let me remind you of something," he said, voice low but resolute. "You came to our lands. Drew lines on our maps. Stole our minerals. Funded coups. And then told us we were the unstable ones." Pete opened his mouth, but Traoré didn't stop. "You talk about endurance. But endurance built on oppression is rot. Your system endures only because you've convinced others it must. I'm not here to threaten it, I'm here to expose it." The moderator had no control now. He simply let it unfold. Traoré's voice sharpened. "I don't need your permission to lead. I don't need your narrative to define my people. I am not a guest in this world, I am a participant. And you are not the narrator." That was it. The audience, silent for most of the segment, burst into applause. Online, clips of the exchange were already trending across platforms, #Traoré, #Power versus Truth, #NotYourNarrator. Pete looked to the camera, then to the moderator, hoping for backup. But even the moderator seemed transfixed by what had just happened. The screen faded to the Fox News outro graphic. But the story didn't fade with it. It erupted. As dawn broke over the skyline of Washington, D.C., the air outside Fox Studios was unusually tense. Inside, Ibrahim Traoré sat in silence, reviewing the footage from last night's explosive debate. He wasn't reviewing it for approval. He was studying it like a battlefield map, every smirk, every insult, every strategic pivot. Pete Hegseth's attack had been personal. But Traoré's response had been purposeful. Across town, Hegseth was doing the opposite. Surrounded by advisors, he was celebrating. "We cornered him," Pete said smugly, sipping his coffee. The guy had no answer for the values question. But his tone faltered when one aide handed him a social media analytics report. Sir. Traoré's clip is trending on every platform. The quote, "I reject your hypocrisy," it's been memed, stitched, and translated in 17 languages. Hegseth frowned. In the days that followed, something shifted. Pete's supporters were still loud, but the conversation had expanded. College students, civil rights leaders, and even a handful of libertarian think tanks began dissecting Traoré's response. He didn't reject American values, one analyst said. He rejected how those values are selectively applied. Meanwhile, Traoré doubled down, not with more media appearances, but with action. He announced a bilateral summit between young American and African policy leaders, focusing on transparency, sovereignty, and mutual respect. "We will not trade truth for applause," he said at the launch. "And we will not be lectured by those unwilling to look in the mirror." Pete couldn't ignore it anymore. On his next show, he tried to walk back his tone, slightly. "I was defending America," he said, "but maybe we should listen, too." It was far from a concession. But it was the first crack. That night, as Traoré stood before a room of young students, some American, some African, he smiled quietly. One student raised their hand and asked, "How did you stay so calm when he insulted you?" He paused. "Because I wasn't there to be liked," he replied. "I was there to be heard." And now, the world was listening. Weeks passed, but the tremor that started in that studio didn't fade, it deepened. Campuses were hosting forums under the banner, "Truth versus Hypocrisy." Protesters outside U.S. embassies held signs quoting Traoré's words. Late-night hosts joked that Pete Hegseth had lost a debate to a calm man with a spine of steel. Pete tried to counter it. He released a podcast titled The Real Story, hoping to reframe the narrative. But people didn't want a polished explanation. They had already heard the raw exchange. They had seen the moment when power flinched and principle stood tall. The State Department issued a carefully worded statement: "We respect all democratic voices on the global stage." But even that landed flat. It felt too little, too late. Meanwhile, Traoré wasn't celebrating. He was strategizing. He invited disillusioned young Americans to speak at Ouagadougou's Civic Forum. "Real alliances," he said, "are not between governments, but between the people brave enough to speak truth to them." His words echoed not as slogans, but as challenges. One night, during a CNN panel recap, a former ambassador said, "You know what scares the establishment most about Traoré? It's not that he's radical. It's that he's reasonable, and still refuses to kneel." Pete Hegseth watched that panel in silence. He didn't slam the remote. He didn't bark. He just sat there, a man who thought the loudest voice wins, realizing, too late, that sometimes it's the quiet truths that thunder. As Traoré stood on the steps of a student university, cameras flashing, chants rising, he turned to a young reporter and said, "They thought this was a debate." It was a beginning. And in that moment, it was clear, the microphone had changed hands. The future wasn't waiting to be given voice. It had already found one. In a world where power often shouts and truth is silenced, one man sat calmly and rewrote the rules. They expected him to flinch. They expected him to fold. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré answered not with anger, but with clarity. Not with rage, but with resolve. And in doing so, he revealed a truth many feared. That dignity doesn't need permission. And real power doesn't bark, it stands. This wasn't just a debate. It was a mirror. And America had to look. Because sometimes, the strongest man in the room is the one who doesn't need to raise his voice.